if you're not getting on as a team, that's when you tend to fall to pieces.
Mm-hmm.
If you lose and you're not getting on, then it collapses.
Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. I'm delighted with part 2 of our campaigner and organisers roundtable, and we have got a couple of, we're going to say experience, because any other adjective will probably get me into trouble, organisers from across the UK that have done some fantastic stuff getting MPs elected and brilliant with their council groups. So first of all, I will start us, the most northernmost of us. So Kevin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm Kevin Lang. I'm a councillor on Edinburgh City Council, and over the last few years I've been campaign manager for Alex Cole-Hamilton in his successful election for the Scottish Parliament in 2016, for Christine Jardine when she was elected in 2017, and most recently in 2019 when I was campaign manager for Wendy Chamberlain in North East Fife. And ultimately, I simply love winning elections.
There we go. Neil?
Yeah, so I'm currently councillor at 3 levels: Abingdon Town Council, Vale of Whitehorse District Council, where I'm on the Cabinet, and Oxfordshire County Council. I've been helping to get people elected for about 30 years now, which has gone quite quickly, really. Doesn't feel that long. Most recently working in Oxford West and Abingdon to get Layla Moran elected as our MP and to win control of the Vale District Council last year as well. And over the years, working with a whole range of people, Evan Harris when we originally won Oxwab, Chris Hume at European regional level, and stints working for ALDC, the campaigns department, and various other people in between. So quite a mix.
And lastly, but by no means least, Mary.
I'm Mary Renier-Wilson. I am not a councillor, never will be. Anybody that elects me would be crazy. I haven't been doing it for anywhere near as long as the others. I joined the party in 2010, did nothing for 5 years. And since 2015, when I first got involved, I've elected 65 councillors, I think. I organised the campaign, organised, not ran, really clearly, the campaign in South Cambs that took control in 2018, and then last year went to Chelmsford and went from 5 councillors to 31 councillors in a single year, which was rather lovely.
So
I haven't even got an MP elected yet, although we came really, really close.
You did come very, very close. And I think, obviously, listeners and viewers watching this will get just a sense of how much experience you've all got and how much success you've all had. Now, before we get into the do's and don'ts and whys and why nots, I mean, can we give just a topical thing of what's happening now with lockdown with your teams and your organisation? Are you struggling to motivate your team? I know South Cambs, I think, had their first virtual council meeting yesterday, I think, is as we're recording this. So should we start with you, Mary, with this one? So how are your teams dealing with lockdown, and how are you getting them going?
We aren't really campaigning, but we're doing it really softly. So what we've done in South Cambs, we've got 103 villages in our council area, every one of which has a parish council. And the council, under the control of our lovely councillors, have really concentrated on community efforts. So we've used the experience that we have to help those community groups. It's not about campaigning, but I'm not averse to it affecting the campaign and making people like us when we start again. But it's about supporting vulnerable people in the community, using the fact that we are more experienced than anybody in getting leaflets out to every house, to help cross-party groups in the villages do that. It's been really good. We've been doing a lot of phoning from Connect. So it's been more of the community organising rather than political campaigning. And hopefully that will stand us in good stead in a few months' time when we can get back to proper politicking.
And Neil, as Layla's chief of staff, how is it getting that balance right then between, obviously there's always kind of a politics involved, but it is soft politics, isn't it? How does Layla do that being an MP and your group, and how hard is that balance right now?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that our approach locally has been very similar to what Mary just described. So the Vale Council, which we run, and South Oxfordshire next door, which is Lib Dem led, it's been very much about supporting the community, looking at what we can do to support community efforts. And Layla's had an emphasis on that as well. In terms of the MP's office, the most notable thing has been an absolute deluge of casework from individuals, small businesses, initially lots of people who were stuck abroad, who we had to help try and get back to the UK, whole range of things. And in terms of motivation, I have to say our team of staff have worked absolutely brilliantly, really hard, despite that coinciding with the point when they were all leaving the office, working out how to work from home and all the rest of it. So we're now in a routine of first thing every morning, we have a team Zoom call. Once a week, we have a slightly more informal, chatty one, specifically so that people can have a chat about how they're feeling and everything. That's worked really well. And then in Parliament, Layla she took a view very early on that her job was not to be sort of shouty opposition, but to identify specific issues as they were coming up from constituents and from around the country on the education side, and holding ministers to account on the areas where they were slipping or where they'd missed groups of people out. And I think that's the right approach. I think it's been pretty successful. The big success was the coronavirus compensation scheme, which started just from a constituent who actually rang up on a radio programme she was doing, someone who was working in the NHS, whose partner was also in the NHS, and they were seriously worried about what would happen if they got ill and died. They got young kids. And that led to the campaign for the compensation scheme, which has come through, not quite at the level we hoped, but a real success. And in terms of motivation as a campaigner, those kind of successes don't come along very often, but when you have a role in something that really changes things for people, that's really what, for me, is what keeps me going.
And obviously, Kevin, you obviously were in charge of overturning the mightiest of majorities at the general election of 2 in the last one. So what has it been like for all your groups that you're involved in? I mean, you seem to be involved with a lot in Scotland, obviously, with all the different parts.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of frustration. And I think it's obviously okay to be frustrated right now. We're a party, and our whole campaigning ethos is about being out there doing stuff, knocking on doors, delivering leaflets, active campaigns. And I think there's a lot of frustration that we can't be out doing that right now. And let's also be open. I think there's a lot of worry about that impacting upon campaigns long term, because, for us to break through, we need to be doing stuff that other parties don't do. And for us, that's about intense campaigning. So there is a lot of concern that we're not able just to get on and be doing that. And I agree with absolutely everything that Mary and Neil have said. What I would also add in, though, is the importance of using this time wisely. And by that, I mean, as Liberal Democrats, we often complain that we're so busy doing things, we don't have time to think. And actually, this is a great time to be thinking. And so when you're thinking about your plans for, not just when we come out of lockdown, but plans for what does your actual election campaign look like? What is your narrative? What is your compelling message to your voters in your ward or your constituency as to why people should vote for you? And also just trying to be identifying who are the people that actually could be part of your team, and what are the skills that you've got available. So whilst it's frustrating that we can't be doing the normal stuff that we'd normally like to be doing, actually never waste a good crisis. And I think it is important for folk to be using this time to be thinking and planning for when we can be going back and doing all the stuff that we normally like to do.
And I think that an example I've got locally is that for the first time ever, we're doing kind of pan-Lancashire kind of coordination ready for the counties. Previously, it was just little silos. It was like, okay, Pendle will do their bit, Preston will do their bit, Burnley will do theirs. And now for the first time, we're actually doing, okay, this is a cross kind of a whole area, we're able to coordinate, find out, okay, where our target seats are going to be, where our resources are going to be kept. And that, I assume that's kind of part of the process as well, particularly because next year's elections are going to be monsters. I think it's the largest set since 1973 or something like that. So that's 10 years before I was born. Getting local parties ready has got to be key.
Yeah, John, I agree. I agree with that. I'm just going to make the point that also as a party, I think we need to move on from what I think has been the case for the last few years, which is almost about looking at every election in isolation from the next. And of course, even if you're not going to win next year, it can be a stepping stone to winning the year after or something else. You know, I've been also doing a little bit of work with the London Lib Dems, and we've been talking about how we use the mayor and the GLA elections now as a milestone and as a stepping stone towards the council elections in 2022. So again, I think because we've got this long-term parliament now, probably 4 years, I think that also gives us a bit of space to be thinking much more strategically across the next 3, 4, 5 years than perhaps we've been able to do over the last 5 years.
I absolutely agree with that. In fact, my next call this afternoon after this one is what we call the Oxfab strategy team. And we're going to be using the next couple of months to refresh our local party campaign plan through to 2024 in exactly the way that Kevin was just describing. I'm delighted to hear that that's the thinking that's going on in London, because I think that's absolutely the right approach to take. I think we need to do that much better as a national party, which the general election review sort of suggested. But also, I'd encourage every local party to be sitting down at this stage and looking forward a few years. And as Kevin said, looking at each year's elections in the interim as a stepping stone or a staging post, whatever you want to call it, and making sure that there's ongoing development. And in my experience, the local parties historically that have taken that approach are usually the ones that end up doing well in the long run, rather than having, in some cases, 1 year of success and then crashing and burning a couple of years later.
I don't have that ability to think for the future at the moment, because next year is going to be the biggest elections that we do. I think we worked out that in Cambridge, people are going to get 8 votes. We've got the Cambridge all-up city council elections. We've got the county council elections. We've got the mayoral election, and we've got the PPC election. You heard it here first. We're going to elect the first ever Lib Dem PCC, because we're going to win the Cambridge mayoralty next year and take control of Cambridge County Council. We did that whole county thing back in 2017. It didn't work brilliantly then because we got hijacked by a general election, which polarised everybody. But we've learned an awful lot of lessons, and so much of the success that we've had in Cambridgeshire over the past few years has been based on the work that was put in then. So next year in the counties is when we actually start to reap the fruits of that, and we have been doing that with we had our first hustings for the mayoralty a couple of days ago. Aidan van der Weer is up against Ron, and we think he's probably going to make it, and we will be getting him elected in a year's time because we've laid that groundwork, and we're getting the candidates in place now so that we can start running out the doors as soon as with a whole slate, as soon as we actually get out of lockdown. And
listening to you guys comparing it to the slightly younger campaigners we had on last week, is there a problem within our party that sometimes we don't like to think of the organising team members, how important they are? I mean, 3 of us are elected, a bit like Neil. I'm a triple-hatted councillor, so I'm in no position to speak. But, and we mentioned this with the other guys, is that I really enjoy getting other people elected, probably more so than I do myself. And do you think there needs to be, we're talking about the structures, and Neil's mentioned the review, about actually a structure for actually the backroom staff to show actually a way that we can almost facilitate the volunteers and get them into maybe employment and stuff like actually a trajectory that people who are really keen actually can think, actually, this is something I really want to get into.
Yeah,
I know. Yeah, go on, Mary.
It's something that we're actually looking at because I'm on FPDC now, and we were talking about this the other day that we're reframing it so that we're not going to be looking at that ladder of engagement of people from when they first sign up on a website to, being an MP. We're going to be changing it into a tree of engagement, because there are going to be multiple different branches that people can take in the different sort of paths of things that they can do for the party. For some people, that will always be about being elected at whatever level. And that's a really important role that is essential to getting us to do things. But, I said I will never be a councillor. I hate people. The concept of just like having to go out and be nice to people and not, it's horrible. And the skills are often very different as well. The skills that you guys use in the council chamber are entirely different to the skills that you use while sitting there getting there. And I used to say that every party needs somebody whose idea of a good night out is sitting in front of a computer with a spreadsheet. And, those people are essential in actually making everything work and freeing up the people who do like people to actually talk to them. You can't really do both effectively.
Yeah, I'd strongly endorse that. I think Mary, in the approach she's taken in the last few years in the areas she's helped, has been absolutely spot on in terms of concentrating on good organisation and building large teams of people. It's something that's certainly been behind a lot of our success in my patch over the last few decades, really. And again, the places that sustain success tend to be those that put effort regularly into building the team.
Where do you think you got the idea from, Neil?
Thank you. It's very easy to fall into the sort of treadmill of producing focus leaflets and knocking on hundreds of doors and that relying on a small team of people to be superhuman. But if you want to succeed long term, you need to build a very large team of people who each do their bit, and to value every bit of activity. So to value, the person who organises at the moment the policy Zoom call discussion evening, as much as the person who artworks the leaflet or who delivers 500 leaflets in their ward or whatever. But also to do that in a structured way and to have a campaign plan that is about constantly building the team and building the skills and encouraging people to get involved as much as it is about delivering leaflets and knocking on doors. And then at a national party level, I do think there's an issue that the approach to employing people and to the training and support for volunteer organisers, of whom there have always been more, it's been very stop-start. It's been very cyclical. And if you are someone who wanted to sort of work as a campaigner, it's never been an easy career path. I'm probably one of a handful of people that have carried on working for the party in any capacity for a long period of time, because it's actually hard work to do it. And I think that's something that the National Party could be a lot better at doing.
Yeah, I was going to add in that I think all that's absolutely right. I also think that one of the mistakes that local parties can make is they become almost too dependent on a paid organiser. So the problem arises then when that organiser is no longer there, is burnt out, leaves, or let's just say you have a bad election cycle for whatever reason, you can't afford that organiser anymore. And ultimately, I think the best organisers are those who build up the skills base around them from volunteers and other people. And the worst organisers are the absolute control freaks, and I will hold my hand up and say at times that's what I've been like in the past, who just thinks it's going to be easier for me to do everything. Now,
no sense of shame in myself.
At some point, that model falls over. So I think it is important. I mean, paid organisers are fantastic assets, and I would always encourage local parties, if you've got the money to employ one, to absolutely do that. But that's not an alternative to building up skills within your own volunteer base.
Yeah. It's also meant to be fun. You know, if you get people doing stuff that they don't like doing, then there's no fun involved and they won't stay. So letting them use skills that they've already got as well as develop them, and finding their own niche of what to do is, I've got one guy who, he spoke to thousands of people during the general election campaign, but he doesn't do any of the wholesaling because he hates it. But he's in a team of 3 ward councillors and they managed to fit that between them. And that's what makes it fun, if you're doing stuff that you actually enjoy rather than stuff that you feel you have to do.
Yeah, that's a really important point. One question I get asked a lot in training sessions is it better to have people canvassing on the doorstep, or is it better to have them doing telephone canvassing? And my answer is, well, ask them which they prefer. Whichever they prefer doing is what they should be doing, because they'll do more of it and it'll be better. And it is about finding out what each person is happiest doing for us and finding them a role where they can do that thing. Obviously, it's not always possible to do everything that way, but that should be the starting point, and that's how you keep people involved and keep them motivated.
And a classic example of what Kevin was saying was, I'm the local party coordinator for Preston and Wyre, and they suddenly decided to call a general election when I was in Japan watching the Rugby World Cup, which was a complete shock. And then suddenly, and because I was the only one designing the leaflet, suddenly they thought, we've got a general election mailing to have to get out. What happens then? So having redundancy of skills is key. But you've all kind of mentioned there some of the talking about motivation, and certainly it can be one of the hardest things is keeping people motivated, because particularly 2019 was a slog. That was hard, and we haven't had elections this year, and I being brutally honest, a lot of my activists were really tired after 2019. But what's the hardest aspect of what you do? Is it dealing with people? I'm not going to say dealing with MPs because I don't want to get you in trouble. But is it dealing with activists? Is it the personal things? Is it keeping people motivated? Kevin, what's the most difficult part of your job?
So let me throw this in. I think one of the most frustrating part of the job that I do is trying to remind people who have been elected that they need to keep doing the things that got them elected. Because it never ceases to amaze me the degree to which attitudes can change. And by that, I mean from councillors right through to MPs, MSPs. And the worst trap I think that an elected person can fall into is to think that everyone will know about all the fantastic work that they're doing. And there's something happens in someone's mind sometimes. I can't know why that happens. But all the good stuff that was done, the knocking on doors, the press releases, the regular leaflets, that sometimes when people get elected, they suddenly then think that stuff doesn't need to happen anymore. But in actual fact, the rules of the game haven't ultimately changed. So I suppose, one thing we've been, and we see this in general elections, council elections can be the same, some of our retention rate hasn't been great. And I think part of that has come from the fact that after somebody is elected, they can take a bit of a campaigning holiday. And generally what I find is when you stop, it's much more difficult to get going again. And I know it's a lot of hard work, and that's just the rules of the game. But the most frustrating thing I find is that people who just either take their foot off the gas or stop and then struggle to get going again. Now, let's be clear, that's not me saying that folk have to run at a general election pace, all year round, across 5 years. Of course, nobody can do that. But I just think that folk need to be careful for those who do get elected and they're defending their seats, that they have to remember that the stuff that they did that got them there is the stuff that's going to get them back there next time.
It's also about backfilling those roles. So, when you do get elected, you have a job to do. We had a huge issue with it because, all of our councillors were the people that were running the campaigns in their areas. So one of the things that we had to do was to have them find other people to do it so that they could actually backfill, and so that they were busy running the council, which is quite a big job apparently. And they had other people who could do the wholesaling and the leaflet production. And because you've suddenly at a swipe taken out, if you're successful, you take out a load of people that don't have the time to necessarily do the stuff that they were doing before, which is again where having big teams comes in, because you get those people coming up behind who can then take over those responsibilities.
Yeah, I think for me, it's generally people, and my natural approach to people is not far away from Mary's. And when you come up against a difficult individual who is just a block on things that need to be done, that can be quite frustrating. I think the other thing I find is, as a party, given what we believe in politically, I think we're not very good always at having an approach to learning and development across the piece. So there's lots of work going on to do something. That's one of the reasons why I decided to take a job with ALDC about 8 years ago now, to try and help put some more of that stuff into practice as a field officer for a while. But generally, as a party, I always think we've forgotten a lot more useful stuff than we seem to remember quite often. And we seem to go through an endless cycle of getting some things wrong, which I always find frustrating. In fact, Kevin has heard me express that view at federal board meetings more than once, probably. Actually, the campaigning stuff I find really easy. I've had it dead easy to write a leaflet or a target letter and get them produced and bundled up and out to people. That side of things is easy because paper doesn't argue with you. You know, it's the persuading the people to do the right thing that's hard work.
And in light of what? Oh, sorry, go on, Mary. Go on.
I think it's about that. I have people that do people who work alongside me, and again, that's been a really important part of it for me. But it's about the frustration of knowing that there is amazing best practice going on in this party. I always say that when people said, how did you win South Cambs? It was like, well, I did what people like Neil and Tim and people have been doing for years. It's not about reinventing the wheel. And so many parties, local parties, want to reinvent the wheel. And that frustration of finding people that are trying to do things and putting loads and loads of effort into doing things. And actually, if they just looked at somewhere that was already doing it well, we've already solved that problem. So it's that lack of being able to spread the best practice and the things that we know work and have been proved to work around all of the other people who are really eager to try and help and get things done, but just haven't got what we've forgotten.
And is that a failing of the party's kind of national approach to training, or is it the fact that, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact winning elections is tough and it's a lot of work, and actually some people, when they realise how much work it is, think, well, it's easier just to have an argument with someone on Twitter rather than actually get out there and use your boot leather and knock on doors. Is it a mix of both, or what's the response to that?
I don't think there's a problem with the training that we have. There's a problem with people knowing it exists. We've got really good training courses coming out of our ears. What we haven't done very well is get people engaged in that. And again, it's something that Abby is doing on FPDC as well. It's not about developing more training. It's about making sure people know that it's there. The level of Kickstart is brilliant, but and it's been the starting point for a hell of a lot of really good campaigners. But so few people actually get to go to it or even know that it exists. So getting that sort of brilliance that we do, getting all these new members knowing that it exists and that they can do it. And one of the things that we're learning from this is how we can do that sort of thing virtually rather than having to have people go off to a training park in wherever it is. I don't even know where it is. Somewhere that people drive me to. Being able to do that sort of stuff virtually is, I think, something that we can really take some learning points from in how to get that best practice spread around.
Yeah, I mean, I'd pretty much agree with that. I think pretty much everything we need in order to train people is in place. for whatever reason, the impression I always had, and this was particularly in my period working with ALDC, but also previously with the campaigns department, was it's almost like local parties fall into two camps. There's one half of them who do know what's out there and do engage and do send teams off to training days or Kickstart or whatever. And then there's another half that don't. And in some of those places, as Mary was saying, there will be people who would do this stuff if they knew about it. And I think that's the challenge. I think there are some party-wide issues. There's some great stuff going on at the moment. I mean, ALDC, I think, have really improved their approach to training steadily over the last few years, and I was very proud to be part of that team. At the moment, the campaigns department team are doing some really good stuff. You're doing some really good online webinars and that kind of thing. So I hope that will develop more. But I still think there's an issue that we've never really got to the point of properly coordinating the training offer as a whole, or in being able to signpost people to where the resources are. So I know that there's loads of really useful stuff on the party website, but every time I go and do a training day or a meeting somewhere, people ask me where to find things, because we don't make it easy enough for people to access the stuff that's out there. So I think there's a challenge there, but it's not that. The frustrating thing is it's not down to a lack of talent or knowledge or ability in the party. It's just we haven't got our act together in terms of getting it all out there to people in an easily accessible form. And you're quite right. There's no magic wand to winning elections that doesn't involve hard work. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of shortcuts by following the best practice that's already been worked through by other people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two elements to this. I mean, I think there's skills training, and then there's kind of almost knowledge training, if that makes sense. So I think it's important that we, as campaigners, as organisers, with our local teams, always explain and take the time to explain why we're doing things. And it was a lesson that I got in North East Fife, because North East Fife was a constituency that I hadn't worked with up until last year. So I came in as this kind of dangerous outsider from West Edinburgh, who was with a lot of scepticism that sat around. Who is this guy coming in? And one of the bits of feedback that I got was that in previous elections, a lot of time had been taken up by arguments during the campaign proper, right? About too many leaflets, tabloid newspapers are terrible, etc., right? So one of the things that I think we did quite successfully, because we spent a lot of time planning it and executing it, was that before the election was called, we had a special session that brought together all of the people who were going to be the key activists, right? And it was quite a big group. And we sat them down in a room and we talked about what it was that they could expect to see and why, really back to first principles. Why were we doing this? What was the purpose of it? So even though it was going to be pitch dark at 4 o'clock in the evening, because it's Scotland, why was it that we couldn't just, stop knocking doors? Why were we doing this? What was the purpose behind it? And actually, I'm not saying that stopped all the arguments, because you will always have arguments in an election campaign. But I do think it helped to build a greater understanding. And I think that when you do have a lot of new people, and I'm going to desperately try and not sound kind of condescending here, because I do think so many of the new folk who've come into the party, they've brought so much new stuff, which has been amazing. But I think we have a responsibility to also explain why the kind of shortcuts that Neil's talking about, which are right, you do these things, you've got a better chance of winning. Why is it gives you a better chance of winning? And not just talking at people, but actually engaging them properly in the purpose of these activities. So they don't think that actually, well, all we have to do is have a street stall every Saturday and it's all going to be fine.
I completely agree with that. We did similar I remember having a big meeting in Oxford right at the start of the campaign, to go through the plan, and it was really interesting and actually genuinely useful as well. And I remember one guy came up afterwards, who we have a lot of very clever people in our membership in Oxford West and Abingdon, as you'd expect. I mean, so a guy came up to me afterwards, and he worked in marketing, niche marketing stuff. And he came up afterwards, and he actually said he'd always begrudged whenever he got a delivery round when there was target letters, because it was so fiddly. Much easier to deliver a leaflet to every house and not worry, listen to your podcast as you're going round or whatever. And he said he always got frustrated until we explained what was behind the data that led to different letters going to different people. At that point, he was not just happy to do it; he was actually delighted, because he suddenly realised there was a real purpose to it and that it had an impact. So I think there's a lot in there. It's about bringing people along with you, and the other key point I think that Kevin alludes to there is having the arguments in advance or very early in the election, not letting them get in the way when it's actually too busy to be wasting time arguing with people on your own side.
And these people often then become your biggest cheerleaders for those ideas if you've explained it to them, because I'm in a similar situation to Neil. We have a lot of really clever people in the South Cambridgeshire and Cambridge parties, and they understand this stuff. That I've had people who just doing role playing on canvassing, and they stand there and they argue and they try and convince the person on the doorstep that they are wrong about Brexit. And as soon as you say to them, nah, that's not what you do. If they are a Brexiteer, just move on to the next door. And they're like, but I'm going to convince them. And you're like, you're not. And that's not actually why we're doing this. And they get it. And then they go on and do it. But I think one of the problems with that is that some of this stuff is so basic to us. And we've forgotten that we learned it. And we forget that these new people coming in, politics is different to other stuff. And we forget that they don't know that, but that as soon as you explain it to them, they can absolutely get it.
My former mentor, who's a chap called Alan Hackett, for anyone who he's a real staple of kind of Lancashire Lib Demism, said to me, Lib Dems are so important in the country because unlike virtually every other party, there are no-go areas for Lib Dems. Whether that's rural, urban, Scotland, Wales, everywhere. Lib Dems get elected everywhere. What, to you, is the biggest part of Lib Dems actually succeeding? Is that true, actually? That's an even basic way. Is it true that there are no-go areas for Lib Dems? You've talked there about Oxford and Cambridge. Is that... We look at the campaign map and see where we are strong, and we are kind of, suburban intellectual areas tend to be our stronghold, and places like Preston, where I am, we have a few pockets here and there. But what's the future for Lib Dems? Can we get beyond those thresholds?
I think there's truth in that point that we can win in any kind of territory. I don't think that means it isn't sometimes a lot easier to win in some territory than in others. I mean, I as you can probably tell, I didn't grow up in Oxfordshire. I grew up in Redcar. I was recruited by a Liberal councillor who was the councillor for the neighbouring ward to where I grew up. And they had to really battle. I mean, this was, back in the late 80s, they did their monthly focus around their ward. It was badly printed and badly typeset. And they got stuck in and did all the door-to-door campaigning and all the rest of it. Then I moved to Leicester, where when I arrived, I think we had 3 councillors. And I spent 6 years there, during which time I got involved and we steadily moved upwards. And then shortly after I left, they ended up running the council for a while, and then crashed and burned. Good example of not building a long-term sustainable local party. And there's still, we've got one councillor there nowadays, still battling away, nice guy. And then I lived in Haringey for a while when we had no councillors. And then in each of those places, actually, at some point later, in some cases 2 decades later, we had a Lib Dem MP, at least for a period of time. And if you told me that Redcar was going to have a Lib Dem MP when I was growing up, I would have laughed at you, But it is possible. And we do have, we can win enough support, whether it's in Labour-facing urban areas, whether it's in Tory-facing rural areas, suburban areas, towns, villages. We can win. And we pretty much know how to win in each of those different areas. But it is hard, at the moment, at this election, you just look at the results. Clearly, if you were fighting in an area that was very anti-Brexit, it gave you a big advantage. And if you were fighting in most constituencies that weren't, it was a lot harder. And one thing I've always said in campaign, I remember going around and doing a presentation after the 2017 election where we regained Oxford West. What I say to people is, we can't determine the circumstances of any given election. What we can do is make sure we've built the capacity, and we've built the organisation, and we've got the campaign plan in place, so that if the circumstances are right, we can win. Because you never win without those things. But sometimes you can do all those things, and if the circumstances are wrong, you still don't win. That's the really hard part of being a Liberal Democrat. And for most people, most of the time, that's the reality. I think there is a lot of truth in that. And I do think, politically, for the country overall, it's one of the reasons why I've stuck with the party and always carried on campaigning, that one of the worst things about our country is the polarisation. And if anybody is going to be in a position to reduce the amount of polarisation there is in our society across the piece, it's us. Because neither of the other two big parties are ever going to do that.
Mm-hmm. Can I come in, John? So I think I agree that we can win anywhere, but where I worry is that folk then take that as an excuse to try everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And by that, I mean, one thing I think Mary has done, from what I've seen, really, really well, did it very well in South Cambridgeshire, I think did it really well in Chelmsford, was having a ruthlessly focused targeting strategy. Yeah. And that's so, so important, because I still worry a little bit, and I see this up here in Scotland to a degree, that because you've got some keen beans, they go off and do their bit here, there's a little bit happening over there, a little bit happening here, and the concept of target wards or target areas begins to get diminished. And ultimately, we know, one word we've not used so far, I think, is intensity. And one of the winning ingredients to winning is intense campaigns. It requires intensity. But to do that, you do need to focus your people and your money and your effort where you've got the best chance of winning. So and I'll be really interested to actually hear from Mary as to how she went about doing that, because that can involve, I think, quite tough and difficult conversations, and not easy. And also, I'm sure it involves sometimes people start off as targets, but when they're not going well, they have to get stood down, and that's a really difficult conversation. So I think we can win anywhere with the right effort, but then you need to make sure you've got the right effort to win.
And before Mary comes in, so it's also, I'm very conscious that some people listening to this podcast are in very small local parties. And what you said there is scalable. So in Preston, we had shrank down to basically 2 wards during coalition. That's where we got to. We had our wards, they were our little fortresses. And so last year, whereas, the fantastic successes Lib Dems had across the country, we knew with our manpower, we could probably win 1 extra ward. That was it. And it was a ward that had been Tory for 40 years. But we thought we just don't have the manpower to go out into the rest of urban Preston and win those seats. We were ruthless. We said, look, we're not even going to do a single bit of canvassing outside of those 3 wards. We will hit them and hit them consistently. And we won it. And we took the entire ward. And so even if you're in a small area with a small local party, I don't want to use that and pick a ward and win it. But that's the kind of nature of it. It's these small victories you can get that can lead to something greater later on. But Mary, you've been asked to come in on this, so show us what you know.
I absolutely agree that every local party can pick a ward and win it. It's just sometimes that it takes too much effort to win particular wards. Yeah. I loved one of the nicest campaigns I did was Sophie Bell, who used to be the chair of Cambridge Student Liberal Democrats. We won her ward, and we went from having not stood a candidate there for 3 years to 60% in one election. And they didn't do an awful lot of it was a short campaign, it wasn't built up at the time. That was a case where the situation was perfect. She was well known in the area, her mum had been a teacher at the school for years. It was just a perfect campaign to do that kind of going from nothing to something. There's no way that would have been a target ward if it wasn't a by-election, because we just didn't have the capacity to do it. South Cambs 2018, we picked 32 wards, 30 of them. Chelmsford, we picked 37, I think, at the start. There was a point about 2 months out where we decided to narrow that down to 28, and that wasn't going to give us victory, and we just kind of had a couple of weeks of being really depressed about the fact that we couldn't win the council, and we were going to have to not win the council. And then things kind of changed, and things started getting a lot better. But there were some difficult conversations. The last results on that night were, there's a photo of me looking ridiculously unattractive and crying my eyes out, because that one was the really important one, because it was the one where we'd had that conversation. We'd actually sat down with Rose, who is now the cabinet member for a greener Chelmsford, and she only joined the party 18 months ago, and she's amazing. But we sat down and had that conversation where we said, you know, we probably aren't going to be able to win. We're really sorry, but we can't. What was really important there, and part of the targeting strategy, and when you go from winning wards to winning councils, is knowing where you don't have to do any work. Again, these are really difficult conversations to have, but we only canvassed 200 people across our 2 top divisions in Chelmsford, one of which is my partner's, and I was really nervous that I wasn't going to get him elected, and that was going to be terrible. So we did a little bit of canvassing towards the end just to double check that the figures we were looking at were right. We didn't do anything on polling day across those 6 seats, and we won both of them with 60% plus of the vote. So that was why we were able to then go big, because we knew that there were whole areas where we were safe. We'd got 100% delivery network. We could just put out leaflets all the time and bolster up that, which meant that those 6 councillors did very, very little in their own wards and were able to move to the other ones. And that's about data. That is about, Neil, I remember you saying a couple of years back that you can tell because you've got the previous get out the vote stuff. So you've got your premiums across time. I now have my spreadsheets across time for every ward, and they're very safely kept on my computer. But being able to look at the data, being able to analyse it across the different wards, so you know where you need to put in your resources and where you need to take them out. And one of the things that we did so successfully as well was, worked a lot better in Chelmsford than it did in South Cambs, is having cross-party campaign days. So it was, we'd have councillors and candidates and their teams doing stuff in their own wards during the evenings, but then at the weekends we would all pile the entire group into one ward. And that worked really well because it builds up that camaraderie amongst the team, but also you don't get biased canvassing. You know, you don't get one ward where you think things are going really well and another where you think things are going badly, just because the candidates have a slightly different way of looking at what it means when people smile at them on the doorsteps. So by having those big action days and masses of canvassing in a particular area by lots of different people, you get far more accurate data that you can base those difficult decisions on. And you have to have that data, because if you're going to have those conversations that say, you know, we don't think we can win, we're going to have to ask you to move somewhere else, you need the numbers to back them up so that those people carry on trusting you.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think it's another argument for why you do need to be trying to do things over a long period of time, actually, because you can't just land in a ward in late March and build up historic data by definition. So you do need to be going a while, and it is why it sometimes takes several rounds of elections in a particular area to win, because actually you're steadily building up your capacity and your recognition, but you're also building up your data over time to get to a point where you got enough data to win with, because you know where enough of your supporters are and enough where the squeeze voters are, but also because you can start to look seriously at that data in terms of predicting what's going on. And as Mary said, having been doing this a few years now in my patch, we can look on polling day at what the figures for a particular ward said last polling day and the polling day before. So we've got a very direct comparison, which is really helpful. Where from an organiser point of view that's helpful is in knowing where to put the extra effort in every bit of the campaign in the last few weeks. So that last year in the Vale of White Horse elections, where for the first time in my campaigning career, we actually gained more seats than we were targeting. There are particular reasons for that, to do with the fact that they were small wards that were surrounded by target wards, and word of mouth and poster displays actually gave the impression that we were doing better than we were in a rural area. So I wouldn't advise that. Kevin's quite right about the discipline needed.
Is winning where you didn't mean to win a good thing or a bad thing from?
In these particular cases, it's turned out that we have two very good councillors, extra councillors, I'm glad to say. But there is always a risk. So that was interesting. But what it did mean, because we had a firm grip of how well we were doing ward by ward, was in the last couple of weeks, I was able to spend my time producing extra target literature, extra emails, etc., for the wards that we knew were the marginal ones at that point. And as Mary's just said, in our case, by that stage, our data was strong enough that we knew we had a list of wards that were going to be fine. We kept delivering the leaflets and kept the presence, but we were able to move the resource to where it was really needed. I think, picking up on Kevin's point, which is really important, one of the things I think we've another area of the advice we've not been brilliant at as a party is giving good advice to local parties on how to get the balance right between the long-term development, which we should be trying to do in lots of places, and the short-term tactics in the run-up to a particular election. And the way you grow long-term is actually by doing steady development in lots of places, but then in the run-up to each round of elections, targeting very tightly in exactly the way Kevin and Mary have described. And I think there's a bit of a sense sometimes in the party that we've forgotten that right balance, and that the message that has been interpreted from the National Party is that targeting for a general election means that we never do anything anywhere else, and that shouldn't be the case. The way I get asked about this in training, and I say to people, well, we should be doing something in lots of places for 10 months every year, and then for 2 months we should put all the effort into the target wards for that round of elections and win them. And there's been, I've seen so many examples of that over the years. I think Kevin is as familiar as I am, I think, with the streets of Watford, for example. The first time I went delivering in Watford was in the ward that ended up being Dorothy Thornhill's ward, at a time where we were down to fighting one ward in Watford in the late 80s. I did a bit of work for them in the mid-90s, and I remember one year when they very excitedly went up from targeting 4 wards to targeting 5 wards. And it really was, for them, it was a ward-by-ward development over years and years and years, quite often getting stuck fighting the same wards for a few years and then expanding. But eventually got to the point where they had a critical mass when the mayoral election came round, and obviously Dorothy then won that. And they've done that over decades now with a really strong team of people who really know what they're doing. And that meant that by the time Dorothy stood down and Peter was selected, I remember having numerous conversations in national meetings where people were really worried about Watford, because how was anyone going to achieve what Dorothy had achieved? And I would say to them, well, I remember when Dorothy was elected, and she wasn't the well-known, famous Dorothy Thornhill we know now. She was just a councillor, not just a councillor, because she's a brilliant woman and brilliant politician. But actually, it was because they built up and sustained that level of campaigning over time. And at that point, I think they were fighting, off the top of my head, I think they were targeting 8 out of 12 wards at that point. And now I think they tend to fight 9 seriously, and I think probably are planning to build up further. But it does take real long-term effort. But it is that balance between knowing what to target in a given round of elections, but then having a plan to expand later, and getting the balance right between those two. And then in general election terms, we've been really lucky here in Oxwab in 2017 when we were trying to win it back. we had massive support from the whole of the region, or the whole of the northern half of our region, South Central region. We had people coming in, including PPCs, bringing teams from right across. By last year, although it was hard work, in the early part of the campaign where it was looking more positive, we were going out and helping neighbouring seats.
I think that's a really key
we
thing.
pulled back in because the data was telling us we weren't going to win any of the neighbouring seats, and we needed to make sure that we were secure, which, as it turned out, we were probably a bit more secure than we knew at that point. But it is really important to keep the targeting very tight during the election period.
I think the really key thing that we've been so bad at explaining, though, is that that's a two-way thing, that going to a target seat is not just for the benefit of the target seat. So, we pulled in huge levels of support over the general election, and not quite as much as we needed, but I've then also gone off to lots of other places, which has been stopped now, but I have a whole pile of people that I have to go and pay back for that. And actually, for a team that is starting up, taking a small group of people to be part of something big and good is one of the best ways to actually build up your team afterwards. Having people be able to get involved in a really good general election campaign in a way that we did in Witney. We didn't win Witney, but we never we never intended to win Witney. That was such a fabulous training and building opportunity, though, for all those teams that went to Witney and saw what best practice looked like, saw what being part of a really good team was like, and then went away and took that invigoration and that learning opportunity and those connections with other people around the party to different places. And one of the amazing things that I found is, and Abby was the person that started this off, was that I was really lucky to go down to Richmond Park in 2016. And I spent 2 fantastic weeks stuck in this little tiny data bunker, just watching people do things right. And it didn't just teach me how to do stuff. It meant that when I came back, I had the phone numbers of people. So even, I couldn't work out how to use a folding machine that I'd never encountered the other day. And it was like 9 o'clock at night, but I managed to actually get Simon Drage on a Zoom call, and I was like showing him the levers and asking him what to do. And it's that sort of networking and making those connections of other people that can help me, which I'm now doing for other people, that is how we really grow things as a party. It is to have people knowing people. And it's something that we haven't pushed as a message of why you should go and help in a target seat. And as soon as you do, it's like you were saying earlier, as soon as you explain these things, people go, oh yeah. And then they come, and then they learn, and then they go back home and win.
I'm conscious of time, but there's just one aspect that we haven't really talked too much. I'm going to start with you, Kevin. Is the importance of money. There's that, data, money, manpower, and data are the legs to success. Is that how you guys all see it? That the importance that actually you've, as well as building a team, actually making sure you have the resources to afford your campaign. Oh, hang on.
Here we go. Yes, you're right. I mean, you need money to run a big campaign. That said, you can do a lot with a little, actually. Now, again, I definitely don't want the message to be that digital campaigning is a replacement for all the other stuff that we're talking about, right? But actually, you can do quite a lot with not a lot of money when it comes to things like Facebook advertising, boosted posts, certainly at a ward level. So I don't want people thinking, well, I'm never going to be able to raise £100,000. So, there's no point in me doing anything. You can do quite a lot with a little. But equally, if you are looking at big scale campaigning, if you're looking at winning a council, if you're looking at winning a constituency, that costs a lot of money. And it costs a lot of money, not just in that 4 weeks, but again, you look at the general election review, one of the big takeaways is you need to plan and structure over years to get to a point where you're doing that final flurry. So having a really good fundraising plan is important. And it also involves people needing to recognize that that's more than raffles. You know, it involves, and actually it's one of the skills. I'm a counsellor, I've been a candidate. It's the thing I hold my hands up and say I've disliked the most. The thing I dislike the most is personally asking for money, right? And it's something that I've had to be trained in, because it actually is a skill. It's a skill which people need to learn. And again, I think the party's done some really, really good training on this. But people do need to understand the importance of identifying people who can give significant amounts of money, and also the importance of how you pitch to that person. So when I was running my council campaign, and bearing in mind that my ward is 25,000 people, so my ward is like a mini constituency, okay, that I had to give a lot of thought to what is my presentation, so that when I was going to donors, it was a professional conversation, because you're asking people to invest either in you personally or in a concept. So in Mary's case, you know, we're trying to win control of Cambridgeshire Council. That's a big thing. So you've got to make that compelling in terms of you've got a good chance of doing this. And also, why does it matter? What's the point? So what? So it's important for people to think about their fundraising plan, that it does involve some big ticket conversations with people, and making sure that you're thinking about what is your pitch to those people who ideally are going to be giving you 4 or maybe in some cases 5-figure sums of money.
Yeah, it's important, but I don't see the raffles and the dinners and stuff mainly as fundraising events. They're membership engagement events primarily. They might raise some money that pay for your costs, but you can't run a campaign on getting bits of money from your members. People do hate it. It's not because the training doesn't exist, it's just really uncomfortable going out and asking people for money. We made Bridget Smith do it in 2018. She didn't want to do it, but we made her do it. Again, we have the data to actually look at this stuff. HQ were really helpful with giving us some people. And I'll always remember a message about 5 weeks before the end of the campaign. We were running out of money, and we'd sent her out to people, and she sent a WhatsApp message at like 10 o'clock in the morning that went, "I've just got £10,000. Can I stop now, please?" And we said yes, because we had it. But you know, getting that, it's scary to a lot of people, but it's so much less effort than running 20 dinners to raise 500 quid each. And there are people, and we're starting now, particularly with so many people that hated Brexit, that there are people out there who have got the money to invest in us. And if you build that compelling case, and as you said, if you seem credible, then you can actually get some really big ticket numbers from particular people who don't necessarily have the time to go out and deliver leaflets, but still believe in a liberal future.
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Kevin and Mary have said. I think in terms of the gap between what we do tend to do as a party and what we have the potential to do as a party, fundraising is probably the widest gap. And that's partly because it's not something we've ever put a massive amount of effort into across the party in terms of training and support and encouragement. I mean, I completely agree with what Kevin said about how you approach the potential big donors. It's something I absolutely agree with him. It's a learned skill, and I've learned a lot about it over the years. Locally, it's something we never really got going. Even the whole period we had Evan as the MP, we never really got very good at it. It's been much easier with Layla, and she is very good at persuading people. The way it often works with us is she will have a coffee or a drink or a chat with somebody and effectively do the warming up, and then I will have the discussion about the sort of detail of what we could spend their money on and do the actual ask. And we've got pretty good, I think, at that approach as a team. The harder part, I think, actually, is not so much raising the money when there's an election on, particularly if it's an election where you genuinely have some momentum. Because I've always found, one way or another, the money usually ends up turning up during an election. It's actually the longer term funding that keeps you going between elections. So to win a parliamentary seat, you really need to be looking at having some staff support, some kind of office base, as well as doing a very high spend on campaign materials on an ongoing basis. And all these things work better if you do them steadily over time. But it's building up the regular income to pay for that actually is the bigger challenge. Many years ago, Chris Huhne was the parliamentary candidate here, 1983 election, I think, or possibly 87. And he set in train something that at that time was known as golden tenants, which was asking members and supporters to pay £10 a month, which back then was a reasonable amount of money. And that set our local party really on a very, very good footing from that point onwards. And it's something we've always worked hard at. And I won't give the figure because I find if I give out figures, it often is disheartening to people in other local parties. But going back, if there's one thing my local party did right, it was starting to sign people up to give regular monthly donations 30 plus years ago, because we've steadily built that up. And we still have a very high income. So we have our main two regular sources of income are standing orders from members and tithes from councillors. And that gives us a base of funding that means we can pretty much pay for our sort of basic staffing and office costs. And then everything else we raise can be spent on campaigning, and that's how we try and run things. But you need to be doing every level well, and again, you need to have a plan. So that the approach we've always taken is try and identify as many different ways of raising funds as you can, and then work out how you steadily increase each of them. So it's very much it's a sort of business planning type approach, but particularly concentrate on the things that build up long-term income, and that has worked well for us. And again, I won't give you the overall figure because you can look on the Electoral Commission website if you're that interested. But the last 4 years in this constituency, I think we've had a level of income and expenditure that I wouldn't have dreamed of 15, 20 years ago. But it hasn't been through any magic wand. It's been through applying best practice reasonably consistently over a long period of time.
The marginal gains, the little things that make everything a little bit easier. I think that's the it's what I learned from people like Neil, but it actually does work. It's not beyond the bounds of anybody to do things. Just things like ordering your target mailing on a spreadsheet before, rather than when it arrives in envelopes, and making all of those little tiny things 10 minutes easier makes everything so much more efficient when you come to the election cycles, and getting everybody into the habit of doing things right all year round.
If anyone of your listeners is particularly interested in the fundraising stuff, there is a really good ALDC manual called Fundraising to Win, I think. I can say that because it's not one of the ones I wrote. There may be some material in there that may have been borrowed from stuff I did write. But it's a really good, for anyone who's interested in that side of stuff, it's a really good booklet full of practical, usable advice.
And before I let you go, because I'm very conscious this is such good advice, you guys might start charging me for it. We've obviously had the election review came out last week at time of recording. You guys have all been in successful areas. Obviously, Neil and Kevin, your parliamentary teams won that seat, and Mary, you narrowly missed out.
1,905.
I know. I'm so sorry to bring it up again. And the pubs aren't even open to console yourself. But what one thing could we take on from that review? What change do we need to see that will really help campaigns on the ground level? What is the one thing we have to, there's lots of things we have to change in that review, but if you were to pick up one thing that would really help most campaign organisers like yourself, what would it be? Shall I start with you, Kevin?
Yeah. So just conscious, firstly, what I would say, obviously with the three of us here, I'm a big follower of American politics. British politics isn't enough for me. I've got to have more. Big follower of American politics. And I'm a big fan of David Axelrod, who was campaign manager for Obama. And one of the things that he said that has always stuck with me is you're never as smart as you look when you win, and you're never as dumb as you look when you lose. And it does pick up the point that was made earlier on, that to a degree, part of it is just the backdrop that's around you. So you look at North East Fife, we managed to win. You know, unfortunately for Mary, you know, her team just missed out. That's not to say that we did everything right, and it's not to say that Mary made mistakes. You know, sometimes it is just about the circumstances that are around you. And the most important thing is to learn from your defeats and learn from your victories, and take them forward. For me, the big thing that came out of the general election review is the importance of having a compelling narrative, a compelling message. And again, if there's a trap that I think some Liberal Democrat campaigns fall into, it's simply thinking that if you do lots of stuff, that on its own is enough. Now, sometimes it can be enough, but often, if you don't actually have a good reason why people should vote Liberal Democrat or vote for your candidate, then actually it doesn't matter how many leaflets you do, how many doors you knock on. If you don't have a compelling narrative, then your campaign can come a cropper. So for me, one of the lessons is that if you are fighting an election campaign, start and ask yourself the first key question, which is, why is it that somebody should vote Liberal Democrat in this election?
Neil, what about you?
Well, Kevin, as is often the case, has the right answer. So I could just say I agree with Kevin, but I'll pick one other point, because I do think Kevin is right, and thinking about the campaign we ran in Oxford, West and Abingdon, and comparing it to the national campaign. When I tell people about what we run, that sometimes they're surprised, because although we were a strongly pro-Remain constituency, actually very little of our local campaign in the constituency was about Brexit. It was all about Layla's record as an MP. It was around the issues that matter to people in the constituency that would swing people who were not primarily motivated by being anti-Brexit, but actually interested in the local health service or schools or whatever other key issues we had. So having a compelling message that has a broad enough appeal to persuade wavering voters our way from all sides is absolutely key. In terms of the review and what it means for the party, for me, it is the stuff around getting better at being a learning party, and a party that invests in learning and development and our capacity across the country. The other thing I would say, because you asked for one, but obviously I'm a politician, so I won't actually answer your question. And this might sound odd coming from someone who is just starting to gear up to help someone run a campaign for party leadership.
That was a question I was going to ask.
All right, we have to get away from the idea that the leader can do everything.
Yeah.
We need a good leader, and we'll all have a view on who we happen to think the best person to do that job is. And there are particular things they need to be able to do well. But we have, as a party, we won't succeed by expecting a leader to deliver victory. And I think, quite as the report says, quite often we've fallen into the trap of expecting the leader to have the answer to every question. And actually, we need to get away from that. We need there to be more of a balance between political leadership, good organisation, effective capacity building across the country, and all the rest of it.
And Mary, to finish us off.
What they said, I think Neil and I agree on everything apart from one fundamental thing. But I think on Kevin's point about the narrative, it's about not just having a narrative that we believe, but having a narrative that actually talks to people. And the people in the party that can write literature that appeals to the things that other people care about rather than us are really, really key to this. And finding something that they can latch onto. So when we were talking about Brexit, we were talking about the fact that we had to stop Brexit, and we were centering the fact that we have to stop Brexit, instead of centering why people are going to suffer from Brexit. So it's about linking that narrative to the things that people on the doorsteps care about. And partly that's going back to Neil's point about learning from that. So the part of the canvassing process that we should be doing, and that some of the best parties do, is that you go out there and you start talking about things. One of the classics is, well, lots of people in your area have been saying, and it can be something that you've entirely made up, but then you find out whether that is an issue that resonates with people. Because we need to remember that the issues that we care about, the issues that we all talk about at conference and that we sit in the bar having huge debates about, are not necessarily the issues that are going to make other people vote for us. They might be really important, they might be key to our fundamental values, but we don't need to find the issues that are important to us. We need to find the issues that are important to change people's voting habits if we're going to win and get into a position where we can actually do something about the things that we think are important.
Brilliant. And I think that's a perfect way to end. I mean, I can't actually express how brilliant that has been for me. I've just looked up the clock and we've been on for over an hour and a quarter. I want to thank you so much for your time. I'm sure all the listeners and viewers really appreciate that. Is top quality advice from all. Like I said, blown away. Just thanks so much. And to all our listeners and viewers, please do go follow these guys, follow their MPs and their council groups, get inspired by what they're doing. And just, we're trying to do a lot of these roundtables, get a good broad view of where the parties are, and just showing you the depth of talent within the Lib Dems is incredible. And we all should be appreciative. And like I said, all of us can do something to maybe win that next seat or help these seats are already there. The general election review was bleak, but actually we have the talent to have a much better future. And so I want to thank you all so much for being a part of this. I want to thank all the listeners and viewers for watching. Do subscribe. Do follow everything to do with the Lib Dem Pod at Lib Dem Pod on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. And thank you so much for listening. And we'll be back with another episode very soon.